Today I'm going to give you an introduction to Captricity and try to leave enough time for asking some questions towards the end of the talk. Feel free, of course, to interrupt me at any time and ask your questions in line with the presentation. So first I want to tell you a little bit about myself, the roots of Captricity, but I think more importantly, get to a description of how it works, where it's used, and then finally the questions that I mentioned. So Captricity came from my research, which was carried out in East Africa. I was in the databases group at UC Berkeley studying for my PhD in computer science. All my friends were doing big data type of work. I decided to try to see how we can leverage the latest data technologies for the lowest resource organization. So I wound up shadowing some community health worker programs and eventually helping to set one up myself, as well as working in an HIV/AIDS program in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. This photo here was just on the outskirts of Dar es Salaam. What I found during my time, my relatively short time, I spent 2009, parts of 2010 in East Africa. What I found was that there's a great appetite for data, and that manifested itself in all sorts of ways, including hand-drawn bar charts on the wall of this health clinic. And what I also saw was that there was a great appetite for data from funding donor organizations as well, under the guise of M&E. And I thought that those two should somehow be aligned in terms of generating useful data for organizations on the ground. But what I found was that they were not always, that was not always the case. What I found instead was that a lot of times organizations would do data entry for the research that's being carried out, and the data would be available 3, 6, maybe 12 months after the actual service was delivered on the ground. And the service delivery process still relied on paper files that, you know, stay in storerooms that look like this. What I also found was that data entry, manual data entry, was everywhere. And so we wanted to create a solution that would, from a data perspective, address this particular problem of data entry being really hard to staff and really hard to make sure runs efficiently and accurately in the most challenging contexts. So that's when we created Captricity, or rather for me, that's when I created the piece of research that we call Shredder, which led to Captricity. So what we do, in a nutshell, is we take documents that look like this. This in particular is a form that the state of California uses for economic disclosures from public servants, so gifts. And we turn that form, after it's uploaded to Captricity, into a spreadsheet that looks like this. Each row of the spreadsheet is one of those forms. You can see in the document column there that the name of the PDF file is there. But every field on the form is pulled out according to a separate column, which we define ahead of time. And so you can see this green shaded box with the number 300. Once I click in it, you can see that the value of that gift was $300. You can also see that the original snippet of the image from the original form is linked, just in case you want to double check that it is what it is. And so that's Captricity in a nutshell. The infrastructure that surrounds Captricity, that turns it into a platform, essentially allows these forms of all types, whether it's patient intake forms, surveys, regulated types of forms in the medical industry. It allows all these forms to automatically flow through to a back-end database, a reporting service that makes the data actionable, and it does so very quickly. That's the promise. What you're then able to do is to receive the data when you actually need it, so that that clinician in the clinic is able to get their data the next day and be able to make decisions like who in my clinic came in the last 3 days with malaria, and at the same time the researchers and the people carrying out M&E can still get their data at the end of the month, or in this case maybe at the end of the week, using the same process. The process that Captricity takes the data through yields 99% plus in terms of accuracy. We did a bake-off that was overseen by the Food and Drug Administration here in the US, and we were able to achieve better data entry accuracy than the best run double entry program, even for unconstrained handwriting. And finally, typically when you use manual data entry workers, it's an entirely manual process. Captricity takes the opposite approach, that we want to make it as automated as possible. In fact, we want to make it such that you can go end-to-end without human intervention. That means we have this API that allows application programmers to just hook into Captricity and use it as if it were a piece of software. Well, that's because it is a piece of software. And so what it means for the bottom line for an organization is that you can roughly eliminate the need to do manual data entry. And the results that come out do not require an additional person to sit there and go over it. You can just put it right into Excel or SPSS or whatever backend system you might be using. And because it's cloud hosted, there's no need to update the software on a computer. You just go to a website. So any internet-enabled device can access Captricity. And finally, one point that we're extremely proud of is that this type of technology exists to some extent in terms of traditional client-server software that you would pay on the order of 7 figures for. So, $1 million implementation is probably fairly normal for the classic category of enterprise data capture. What we've done is we've made it so that any size organization can afford it with the subscription model, where you're not paying for a big upfront cost, but rather just with a subscription fee. These are all aspects that we learned to be vital in order to serve those initial clients that we set out to serve in those East African health clinics. And we still, to this day, serve many of those clients, although our client base has broadened to a great extent. And so I think I mentioned a bunch of these benefits already, so I'll skip over this particular slide and jump into the most exciting part. I can talk about this all day, which is how does it work? So what we do is we think about the world in 3 distinct steps: capture, convert, use. And we're the experts in conversion. And so the capture step is actually up to you. What we ask our customers to do is by a variety of ways image a paper form that you're dealing with. And so it could be your run-of-the-mill office scanner, a copy fax multifunction device kind of thing. We've carried out a countrywide study in Mali that was done with a Canon PowerShot camera running on AA batteries. Talk about appropriate technology, right? There's not even a need for electricity in that case. Some of you might be familiar with the Humanitarian Toolkit that internews and Captricity and Columbia put together. And that is essentially a briefcase that holds within it a solar charger, portable scanner, and a bunch of paper forms. And of course, we have very high volume customers that use the latest and greatest production line scanners. We also have customers that send us their forms by fax or by email attachment. Those are all valid ways. You just have to find some way of getting that image to Captricity. Now, once Captricity receives the form, what we do is we use a combination of human and machine prediction together, interleaved, to predict the values at an extremely high level of accuracy. And the thing about Captricity is that it's a hosted web service, and being a cloud-native service, it expands dynamically to demand. Put it another way, no matter how many forms you send Captricity, it will actually dynamically add to the number of computers and to the number of human verifiers that will make sure that your data is correct and it gets back to you in time. And what's more, what Captricity does on the back end is that it learns over time about your form. And so the more of a form you send to Captricity, the more accurate and faster does it get. And so the end result is that you get usable data at the accuracy of human beings, but with the speed and cost of a piece of software. So just earlier I said, human verifiers, and some of you might have, perked up at that mention, because as soon as we mention, human, you would think, well, what about privacy? What about security? What we do in the same process where you're marking up a form, so let's say this fictitious application form in front of us, in the same process that we're marking up this form, we're also cutting out each field and ordering the fields in such a way that our human workers don't ever see more than one piece of information at a time from a single page. And they also don't know whose form it is, for what reason is it being digitized. And so they might see a run of 2-digit numbers, but they don't know if that is the date of a part of a date, or the middle 2 numbers of a social security number, or anything like that. So it's without context. And based on this shredded approach, we're able to maintain 100% HIPAA compliance. Now, HIPAA is a set of healthcare privacy regulations in the United States. And what's much more, let's call it rigorous than HIPAA, is the U.S. federal government's standards for information security. And we're able to achieve an ATO, which is called an authorization to operate, from the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, essentially unlocking the ability for Captricity to serve the U.S. government. And we found that this particular certification has been good enough, or rather, almost like the magic, the magic for us to get past the security concerns of some of the most conservative organizations in the world. And so we're confident that this will work for you as well. So just to contrast what I've said to technologies that you may already be familiar with, this is not OCR, or optical character recognition. OCR traditionally only recognizes printed text, so nice computer fonts that you scan with very high resolution. This is able to read anything, and this is not an outsourced operation. It's a software service, and anyone can access it. You don't have to sign a big contract. In fact, there's a free plan. So I encourage you all to go to Captricity.com and at least sign up for the free plan, and just check it out. You get 10 pages a month of digitization that you can use for anything. And finally, it's not a closed system. We're not in the business of trying to hold on to your data and sort of lock you in. In fact, that we open up our API completely so that all of the user interface features that you see, you can actually build your own equivalent version of it and just talk to our API. And so it can be componentized and plugged into your various applications. So practically and on the ground, I put this slide here to show you some of the more maybe context-appropriate scanning solutions. So if you have, let's say, a clinic, or you're on the road in the field, and all you have is a mobile phone, you can use on the top right there this $30 mobile phone stand for capturing almost perfect images with a phone. If you have pretty intensive register books, you might want to spring for the slightly more expensive book scanning device, although that can be built with a semi-skilled carpenter and a couple of pieces of wood as well. You can see the stand there. Of course, there's this little tiny handheld batch scanner that works wonders. And we're actually partnered with Canon. They make the cameras and the scanners to bring the best set of scanners to our customers. So in the software, if you log in and create an account, what you'll see is the first thing it asks you to do is to essentially drag and drop a bunch of scanned images into the browser. You can also store your images in Box or Dropbox. And so one common use case to get over the lack of internet or the intermittent internet is to use the background synchronization feature of a Box or Dropbox and let that sync, and then we can actually just pull it over from data center to data center from Box or Dropbox into Captricity. And that way, you can even use Captricity with a GPRS connection. The next thing that we do is the Captricity will ask the user to create a template of their form. And so here is a particular form for an infant HIV diagnostic test. And we're essentially going to have the user draws these green boxes around the area of the form where interesting data are. Each box is given a name, and you tell us what type of information is it. Is it a date? Is it a number? Is it a multiple choice question? In this case, it is a multiple choice question. And so we specify those. And each page of a form might take you somewhere between 10 to 15 minutes, but that's a one-time thing. So after that, we digitize the uploaded set of documents according to the forms, and we produce the spreadsheet, which I showed you earlier. And I just want to show you a couple of the data review features, because the question always comes down to accuracy and quality. And so we're able to distinguish between what you're seeing here as the scratched out text, as we're just totally ignoring that, and digitizing the information beside it. And this is one example of where our digitization and extraction accuracy can actually achieve the rates that we have, because we're able to handle fields that look like this. Of course, if you ever have any questions, we can always go back to look at the entirety of the form. If a particular form set or document did not come through correctly or is the incorrect one, you can actually just exclude it from a data set. And finally, if there happens to be a lot of values that come out as what we call impossible, like this one, so it's entirely scratched out, and so what should you do? We don't know. And so here's one key feature is we will admit when we don't know, and we'll mark something as impossible, and we make it really easy for you to review all of the impossibles in the system and either give them blank values or alternate values before you mark this whole data set as having been reviewed and ready for use. We try to make it very easy for you to access the data. So you can download it via Excel, you can export it to a Google spreadsheet. But often the data is most useful in a database. And so we've spent the time to create a deep integration with Salesforce.com. A lot of organizations are using Salesforce, not only for sales and marketing, but for just as a general use database. And so here's an example. If you don't use Salesforce, what we can take away from this view is that here's an example of something that we can use, of a mapping interface we can use to take the data and automatically push it into a backend database. It could be OpenMRS, the EMR that's often used. It could be some kind of survey software. So the options are really limitless in terms of potential integration. And so exporting, then after the mapping is created, just one button push, and you're done. So that's how Captricity works. Before I launch into a few of the case studies, I wanted to pause here and see if you had any questions. Okay, let me go on. So just a few case studies for you. Three, I believe. So we're always the most proud and engaged when we get to work on problems that kind of inform the mission or you know, like close to the mission. And we help this really great organization called Synergy, which is working in the Nakuru slums near Nairobi. What they do is they deploy toilets so that the open pit latrines wouldn't be used as often. And what they need is a monitoring solution to make sure that the toilets are cleaned and to track how much use is a particular toilet getting, so that they can go and, you know, haul the waste for reuse. Part of the model. And essentially what they're able to do is to reduce their data entry workload. In doing so, about 20x, saving whole FTEs worth of time, so that they could be, you know, put to use doing much more important things. And for us, what's really compelling is that they also use Salesforce. And so from end to end, they were able to build an enterprise-grade dashboard that essentially near real time based on conditions in one of the most challenging places in the world. And that to us is a prime example of Captricity fulfilling its mission. For quite a few development organizations, including JPAL here, the Poverty Action Lab based in MIT, we do a lot of survey work. In this particular case, 30,000 handwritten voter surveys from the recent presidential election were digitized. What's important to note is that they did not have to redesign any forms. These were already done, and they just went back in time to grab the information. And to just, you know, as a counterpoint for you, this is data that was used to study the impact of SMS messaging, right? And so I know that, you know, SMS-based data collection was pretty popular. Maybe is pretty popular, but maybe was is the right word. There's been many interventions of mobile-based systems that Captricity has actually handled the actual data collection based on. And that should tell you something. You know, I love the idea of a mobile intervention, but sometimes the most practical application is still something like paper. I'm just going to switch over. Is there a question? Okay, no worries. Another example for you is the SCIU out in LA, Los Angeles. So they're a labor union, but they also do a lot of health promotion and recruitment. And so what they wanted to do was to collect information from low-income workers about their need for health insurance. These are fast food workers, essentially. And in a sort of a pretty keen, clear juxtaposition was that every year they hold this big event, and they put out I think one of these online sign-up forms for the event, and something like 200 people signed up, and they're panicked because 200 is not very many for the numbers that they're trying to turn out. It turns out 20,000 people showed up to their event in one day, and it kind of shows you that online forums, they're great, but for certain audiences they only go so far. And what they did with Captricity is that they had a bus full of volunteers with clipboards. They were able to get 5,000 people signed up, answering the questionnaire. And by Monday morning, they had a dashboard of people that were ready for outreach from this program. Another case that Captricity in action is for. So far we've covered with Synergy on the ground dashboard making. We've done a couple cases of surveys. This one is different. This one with the city of Philadelphia, what we're doing there is we're actually creating a predictive database. They're calling it Moneyball in criminal justice, but really what's happening is that somebody said we should use the same level of statistical and analytical rigor that we bring to baseball. It's something that's arguably just as important, if not more important, the topic of domestic violence. And so the Philly PD already spends quite a bit of effort to use this extended police report for domestic violence, some 60 different fields of information, but it's just filed away because it's on paper. That's the only practical solution. And so Captricity came in, and we're digitizing about 140,000 documents for the last year, and we're going to pull it together to try to figure out what's actually happening on the ground, and see if we can create a playbook along with these data science researchers, a playbook for how does a beat cop and how does a policymaker in the city of Philadelphia deal with any particular trends or any particular case of domestic violence. And finally, our biggest case in terms of working with the government was the FDA. The FDA, their main mission is to keep on top of adverse events in drugs that are happening, and to do so, they take in a adverse event report. Due to data entry load, they developed a 120-day backlog. This was compromising the mission, and so being responsible, they even put out a press release discussing it. They wanted something that scaled, more than just adding more heads, manual data typists, to solve the problem, because they knew that volume was going up and their budget was not going up. So they had to do more with less. And bringing in Captricity, we're able to essentially help them clear the backlog in a short amount of time, in what we would consider a record amount of time in terms of getting through contracting, security review for the government. And now we're contending to carry on the ongoing work, and it looks like that might become a reality soon. So just a select list of customers that we have. What I'm intending to show here is that this is a broadly applicable technology that could help many different domains. And that's it. So let me switch back here to the Google Hangout and see if you have any questions.
Yeah. Thanks, Long. So I'm curious, what kind of services or support do you provide in-house to organizations who are trying to use Captricity and maybe might not know the software or the technology too well?
Sure, that's a good question. We intend the software to be self-serve. In the lower tiers, whether it's the free tier or the $75 a month tier, we have tutorials and email support, and typically people don't really need us for anything. Like we targeted very deliberately to make the software as easy to use as something like SurveyMonkey or Microsoft Excel. For more complex integrations, for what we would call our enterprise integrations, we actually have a fully staffed professional services team that will, come on site, do requirements gathering, and provide as much support as necessary to get a full solution going. We realize that sometimes that level of help is necessary. And so, I guess to answer your question, it runs a spectrum from completely self-serve on one end to a full-service end-to-end service on the other.
I'm also curious to hear where you see Captricity developing in the future. I think you've made a really strong case for the continued relevance of paper. But as you were saying, SMS is growing in popularity and other forms of data as well, data collection. And I'm just curious to hear from you where you think the company may go in the future in terms of different directions.
I'd love to answer the question about the company, but first let me, comment on about SMS. I don't mean to, talk smack about SMS. I love the concept of collecting data via short message. It's just that SMS is only appropriate for collecting information in one narrow case, which is one bit of information from people that you don't know. Like, that's about the case. And then there's other much better tools like Open Data Kit that will allow you to collect slightly more information. Those are necessarily from people that you trust because you're going to hand them an extremely expensive handset. And so where Captricity comes in is we're actually not about paper. We're about the data, and we're about the most appropriate way of getting to the data. And so this is sort of almost like an allergic reaction to technologists with wielding this technology hammer looking for a nail. We're starting at the data and saying, look, the data's there, and we're going to go get it, and it happens to be in paper, so we're going to solve the paper problem first. And the future of Captricity is wound up in that. We're trying to be essentially a practical data enablement company. And so where we are going is that allowing organizations to now collect information both on paper as well as with, let's say, mobile phones or web forms. The mobile phone and the web form, once we know the schema of the data or the blueprint or the list of questions that you want to ask, is just a feature. We can in fact already generate, if you're familiar with the tech lingo, we already generate for every single Captricity form that you define an X form definition for that form, such that you can load it into something like Open Data Kit, so that you can be collecting the same pieces of information with paper or a mobile form. And we're going to make that as seamless as possible, so that when you encounter any kind of situation on the ground, you can use the most appropriate channel, and all the data comes to live in the same place, and you can use the same mapping interfaces and data transformation interfaces to put that into the database or analytical software of record that you want to use. That's where we're going.
This is Mike. I'm sorry if you've answered this question already. I just want to make sure I understand what the answer is. When you say you generate an X form, from once you have the structure of the data, you generate the X form. How hand-tooled a process is that, or is that automatic?
It's automatic.
Because it should be able. I mean, I certainly some basic types of data can be automatically recognized. But if you're used to an environment where data has to be really structured in order to be queried, you always wonder how flat these files really are.
Could you unpack the flat comment?
Well, look, maybe you only have two types of data, like numbers and words, but maybe you have, in a typical relational database, which is sort of the opposite of a flat, Excel type spreadsheet with categories. You end up structuring the data relationships a lot so that you can ask certain kinds of sophisticated queries. But it sounds like you're not doing that. It sounds like you're really doing, except for some basic typing of data types, this is not deeply structured beyond that. The data itself isn't. Is that right?
I think I understand what you're saying. I came out of the databases group at Berkeley, and so I have an appreciation for complex data types. And I think one of the key aspects of paper forms is that it's not a complex data type. Sometimes there are nested recurring elements like rows of a table, and in which case we handle that gracefully. But essentially, the output is a denormalized table that you can use directly for analysis without joins. If you want to do joins, you can map the same table to the same output file to multiple tables, and go through some kind of entity resolution or primary key identification process, and to normalize the data later. So we have companies or customers that we write custom transformation scripts for, where we essentially normalize the data before we put it into their database. Most of our customers actually want square data. That's sort of the data analyst dream, right? Data wants to be square, and so we make square pieces of data you can plug right into an Excel. And so in that way, yes, we're super simple at that.
Yeah, okay, you've answered my question. I'm sorry if I made it more complicated than it needed to be, but you have answered it.